2 a.m. Lucas Bennett received a call from an unknown number. A panicked woman's voice. "Help me, I'm stuck." He was about to ask questions when the voice rang out again. "You have to come. Daniel said you would help." Lucas froze. Daniel, the man who had once saved his life. The memory crashed through his mind like lightning. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and ran out the door. When he arrived, Lucas found CEO Clara Sterling and her daughter Emma in the apartment. Clara was on her knees, clutching her stomach in severe pain. In that moment, Clara saw the man her husband had told her about. "If anything happens, only call Lucas." The call was actually meant for someone else, but fate had connected them. Lucas Bennett was 34 years old, a single dad living in an old but warm apartment on the outskirts of Boston. He was tall and strong, but his face was gaunt from working himself to exhaustion, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. He had lost his wife 3 years ago in a car accident that still haunted his dreams. The grief had left him hollow, empty, barely functioning. His daughter Emily, now 6 years old, was the only reason he kept going. The only reason he got up each morning. The only reason he hadn't completely given up. Emily was a smart, curious child, but she was afraid of the dark. Every single night she needed her father to read her a story before she could fall asleep. It was their ritual, their connection, the thread that held them both together. Lucas worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. He was a technician during the day, fixing broken equipment at a manufacturing plant. In the evenings, he delivered packages for a courier service. And late at night, when Emily was asleep at his sister's house, he did odd repair jobs for neighbors, fixing anything from leaky faucets to broken furniture. There were no other options. This was survival. He kept Emily's old baby shoes in a drawer by his bed, a reminder that no matter how poor they were, no matter how tired he became, he had to do everything possible to take care of his daughter. That small pair of worn-out shoes was his anchor, his reason for pushing through the pain and exhaustion. Daniel Sterling had been the man who saved Lucas's life years ago when they were both part of an emergency rescue team. Daniel had pulled Lucas from a collapsed building during a training exercise gone wrong. Lucas had been trapped, panicking, certain he was going to die, but Daniel stayed calm, talked him through it, and got him out. Daniel died 6 months later in an accident, a rescue operation that went wrong. Lucas had been off duty that day and the guilt consumed him. He should have been there. He could have helped. Maybe Daniel would still be alive if Lucas had been there. The last words Daniel ever said to him still echoed in his mind. "Don't ever let fear make you stand still, brother. When someone needs help, you move. You don't think. You just move." Those words haunted Lucas, because after Daniel died, Lucas had quit the rescue team. He couldn't handle it anymore. The pressure, the risk, the constant reminder of what he had lost. He had let fear make him stand still. He had failed Daniel's final lesson. Clara Sterling was 30 years old, the CEO of Sterling Group, a successful real estate development company. She was a widow, raising her daughter alone. People called her the Ice Queen CEO because of her cold, calculated business demeanor. She never smiled in meetings. She never showed weakness. She was beautiful, powerful, and completely untouchable. But beneath that facade, Clara was suffering. She had a chronic stomach condition caused by years of relentless stress. The pain came in waves, unpredictable and agonizing. She managed it with medication and sheer willpower, but it was getting worse. Emma, her 4-year-old daughter, was shy and quiet, but she loved her mother fiercely. Whenever Clara was in pain, Emma would cry, holding her mother's hand and asking if she was going to be okay. It broke Clara's heart every time. Clara's life looked perfect from the outside. Success, wealth, influence. But the truth was, she was exhausted. She had been running on fumes for months, maybe years. And tonight, everything finally caught up with her. Lucas and Clara had never met. Their lives were completely separate, moving in different worlds. But fate had a way of bringing people together when they least expected it. That night, Lucas was sitting at his kitchen table, sewing a patch onto Emily's favorite shoe. It was nearly worn through, and he couldn't afford to buy her new ones yet. The clock on the wall read 2:03 a.m. Then his phone rang. Lucas stared at the screen. Unknown number. His first instinct was to ignore it. Calls at 2 a.m. were never good news. But something made him answer. Hello? The voice on the other end was panicked, breathless, barely coherent. Help me, please. I'm stuck. I can't. Who is this? Lucas asked, already standing up, his body responding before his mind caught up. You have to come. Daniel said you would help. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Daniel. Lucas's heart stopped. His hands started shaking. Daniel was dead. Daniel had been dead for years. How could this person know that name? How could they know to say it to him? Where are you? Lucas demanded, his voice sharp, focused, slipping back into the emergency response mode he thought he had left behind forever. The woman gave him an address through gasps of pain. Lucas grabbed his jacket, his keys, his phone. He ran to his neighbor's apartment, knocked urgently until the elderly woman answered. Mrs. Chen, I need you to watch Emily. Emergency, please. Mrs. Chen, bless her, asked no questions. She simply nodded and shuffled toward his apartment. Lucas ran to his car, his mind racing Daniel's name. Why would someone invoke Daniel's name? Who was this woman? What was happening? He didn't know. But Daniel's last words echoed in his head. When someone needs help, you move. You don't think, you just move. So Lucas moved. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Lucas arrived at the address 15 minutes later. It was an upscale apartment building in downtown Boston. The kind of place where rent for 1 month probably equaled his entire yearly income. He ran through the lobby, ignoring the confused looks from the night security guard, and took the elevator to the 8th floor. Apartment 804. The door was slightly ajar. Lucas pushed it open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him was chaos. Furniture was knocked over. A lamp lay broken on the floor, and in the middle of it all, a woman was on her knees, clutching her stomach, her face pale and covered in cold sweat. Next to her, a little girl with dark hair and tear-streaked cheeks was sobbing uncontrollably. Mommy, Mommy, please wake up. Lucas ran to the woman and knelt beside her. Her hands were ice cold. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. These were signs of shock. He had seen them before, many times during his years on the rescue team. Ma'am, can you hear me? Lucas asked, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The woman's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him with confusion and pain. Who are you? My name is Lucas. You called me, or someone called me. I'm here to help. At that moment, doors began opening along the hallway. Neighbors, woken by the commotion, stepped out to see what was happening. An older man in an expensive bathrobe peered into the apartment. What's going on here? Who are you? A woman in silk pajamas gasped. Is that Clara Sterling? Oh my God, what happened? But then their eyes landed on Lucas, his worn jeans, his faded jacket, his working-class appearance in this world of wealth and privilege. The older man's expression shifted from concern to suspicion. Wait, who is this man? Clara, do you know him? He's... Clara tried to speak, but the pain was too intense. She doubled over, a moan escaping her lips. A wealthy-looking woman crossed her arms and said loudly, a single dad from the poor side of town, and the CEO calls him in the middle of the night? This is ridiculous. Another neighbor, a man in designer loungewear, laughed mockingly. If she's sick, she should call a doctor, not some random man. The little girl, Emma, looked up at Lucas with desperate, pleading eyes. Please help my mommy, please. Lucas ignored every insult, every mocking comment. His focus was entirely on Clara. He had seen cases like this before. The symptoms were textbook: cold sweats, rapid breathing, severe abdominal pain, pale skin. This was acute gastric bleeding. She was in serious danger. Someone call 911, now! Lucas shouted with authority that surprised everyone. The crowd laughed. The woman in silk pajamas smirked. You think you're a doctor? I don't think anything, Lucas snapped. I know what I'm looking at. She's bleeding internally. If we don't get her to a hospital immediately, she could die. That's absurd, the older man said dismissively. She probably just ate something bad. Lucas didn't waste another second arguing. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 himself. When the operator answered, he spoke with clinical precision. "I need an ambulance at 2247 Beacon Street, apartment 804. Female, approximately 30 years old, presenting with acute abdominal pain, cold sweats, rapid shallow breathing, and signs of hypovolemic shock. Possible gastric hemorrhage. She needs immediate transport." There was a pause on the other end. Then the operator's tone changed, becoming urgent. "Ambulance is on the way. ETA 6 minutes. Sir, do you have medical training?" "Yes," Lucas said simply. The hallway went silent. Everyone stared at him. Clara's breathing became more labored. Emma clutched Lucas's arm, her small body shaking with fear. "Please don't let my mommy die." Lucas knelt down to Emma's eye level and spoke gently. "I'm not going to let anything happen to your mommy, okay? I promise." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. Lucas turned back to Clara and carefully laid her on her side in the recovery position. He grabbed a blanket from the couch and covered her to keep her warm, a critical step in treating shock. "Stay with me, Clara," he said softly. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or gratitude, or just the simple human connection of one person helping another in their darkest moment. Then her eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness. "Clara!" Lucas checked her pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. Emma screamed. The neighbors, who had been mocking and skeptical moments before, now stood frozen, realizing the gravity of the situation. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. The ambulance arrived exactly 6 minutes later. 2 paramedics burst through the door with a stretcher and emergency equipment. "Mail caller?" one of them asked. "That's me," Lucas said, stepping aside to give them room. "What's her status?" "She lost consciousness about 90 seconds ago. Pulse is weak and rapid, breathing shallow. I suspect upper GI bleed based on symptom presentation." The paramedic looked at Lucas with new respect. "You were right to call. She's in shock. We need to move now." They lifted Clara onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency. One of the paramedics started an IV line immediately. Emma stood frozen, watching her mother being taken away. Lucas scooped the little girl up in his arms. "Come on, sweetheart. We're going with her." The paramedic looked at him. "Are you family?" Lucas hesitated for just a second. "No, but I'm not leaving her alone." The paramedic nodded. "Get in." Lucas climbed into the ambulance, still holding Emma. He sat next to Clara, one hand on the little girl, one hand steadying Clara's shoulder. As the ambulance pulled away, Lucas looked back at the crowd of neighbors standing in the hallway. Their faces were a mixture of shame, shock, and guilt. They had judged him, mocked him, dismissed him, and they had been wrong about everything. The ambulance raced through the dark streets of Boston, sirens screaming, lights flashing. Emma buried her face in Lucas's chest. "Is my mommy going to be okay?" Lucas held her tight. "I'm going to make sure she is." "Would you have stayed silent or spoken up?" The emergency room at Boston General Hospital was bright, sterile, and chaotic. Doctors and nurses moved with controlled urgency as they wheeled Clara into a treatment room. Lucas stood in the waiting area, still holding Emma, who had cried herself into exhausted silence against his shoulder. A nurse approached him with a clipboard. "Sir, are you the patient's husband?" "No," Lucas said, "just someone who was there when she needed help." The nurse looked at him curiously, then at the little girl in his arms. "We're going to need to contact her family." "I don't know who to call," Lucas admitted. "I don't even know her last name." "Sterling," a voice said from behind him. Lucas turned to see a well-dressed woman in her 50s, slightly out of breath. "Her name is Clara Sterling. I'm Margaret Chen, her executive assistant. I got a call from building security." Margaret looked at Lucas with surprise. "Who are you?" "Lucas Bennett. I got a call from Clara tonight. She was in trouble. I came to help." Margaret's eyes widened. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through something, then looked back at Lucas with an expression of shock. "Lucas Bennett. Daniel's Lucas?" Now it was Lucas's turn to be surprised. How do you know that name? Before Margaret could answer, a doctor emerged from the treatment room. Family of Clara Sterling? That's me, Margaret said quickly. How is she? The doctor's expression was grave. She had a severe gastric hemorrhage. Are you fine? If she had arrived 10 minutes later, we might not have been able to save her. Whoever made that 911 call and gave us the preliminary diagnosis saved her life. All eyes turned to Lucas. Margaret stared at him. That was you? Lucas nodded. Are you a doctor? No, I used to be a tactical paramedic, emergency rescue team, years ago. The doctor extended his hand to Lucas. Thank you. Your assessment was textbook perfect. You probably saved her life. Lucas shook his hand but said nothing. In his arms, Emma stirred and looked up at him. Did you save my mommy? Lucas smiled softly. The doctors saved your mommy. I just got her here. But Emma shook her head. You saved her. You're a hero. Over the next hour, more people arrived. A security detail from Sterling Group, several board members who had heard about the CEO's hospitalization, and slowly the full story began to emerge. One of the neighbors from the apartment building showed up, the older man who had been so dismissive earlier. He approached Lucas hesitantly. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I judged you unfairly. I'm sorry. Lucas just nodded. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to her when she wakes up. Others came as well. The woman in silk pajamas, the man in designer loungewear. All of them looked ashamed. All of them knew they had been wrong. But Lucas didn't care about their apologies. He only cared about one thing, making sure Clara was okay. A doctor approached him, the same one who had recognized his emergency training. Can I speak with you privately? They stepped away from the crowd. The doctor lowered his voice. The way you handled that scene, the positioning, the assessment, the call, that's not just basic first aid. You were a tactical medic, weren't you? Lucas nodded. Boston Emergency Rescue, 6 years. I left 3 years ago. Why did you leave? Lucas's jaw tightened. I lost someone important. I couldn't do it anymore. The doctor looked at him with understanding. I'm sorry, but for what it's worth, you haven't lost your skills. You saved a life tonight. After another hour, Clara was moved to a private room. She was stable, sedated, but out of immediate danger. Margaret arranged for Emma to stay in the room with her mother, and Lucas helped settle the little girl into a chair beside the bed. Emma looked up at him. You're not leaving, are you? Lucas hesitated. He should leave. He had done what he came to do. Clara was safe. His job was done. But looking at Emma's frightened face, remembering the promise he had made to her in the ambulance, he couldn't just walk away. I'll stay a little longer, he said. Emma smiled and grabbed his hand. Margaret pulled Lucas aside. I need to show you something. She led him to a quiet corner of the waiting area and pulled out her phone. She opened a file and showed him a scanned document. It was a handwritten letter. Lucas began to read and his heart stopped. Margaret, if anything ever happens to me, I need you to do something. There's a man named Lucas Bennett. He was my best friend. He saved my life once during a rescue operation that went wrong. If Clara or Emma ever need help, if they're ever in danger, find Lucas. He'll never let them down. He's the most reliable person I've ever known. Promise me you'll remember his name. Promise me you'll find him if they need him. The letter was signed by Daniel Sterling. Lucas stared at the words, his vision blurring with tears. Daniel Sterling, the man who had saved his life, the man whose death he had never forgiven himself for. Daniel Sterling was Clara's husband, Margaret said quietly. He died in a rescue operation 2 years ago, an industrial accident at a construction site. He was trying to save workers trapped inside. Lucas's hands were shaking. I didn't know he got married. I lost touch with him after I left the team. He never forgot you, Margaret said. He told Clara about you. He told her that if anything ever happened to him, if she or Emma were ever in trouble, to find you, to call you. But she didn't call me, Lucas said, confused. She called someone else, didn't she? The call was a mistake. Margaret pulled up another file on her phone. She keeps her emergency contacts listed by first name in her phone. Tonight, when the pain hit, and she could barely think. She tried to call her assistant, Luke Harrison, who lives nearby, but her vision was blurred and she hit the wrong contact. Lucas Bennett. Your number was still saved in her phone from 2 years ago when Daniel gave it to her. Lucas felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. So it was a wrong number, a mistake. No, Margaret said firmly. It was fate. Daniel made sure your number was in that phone. He made sure Clara would find you if she needed you. And tonight, even through pain and fear and confusion, some part of her remembered. Some part of her reached for the name Daniel trusted most. Lucas sat down heavily in a chair. His mind was reeling. Daniel had trusted him. Even after death, even after everything, Daniel had left him this responsibility, this connection to the family he left behind. A nurse approached them. Mr. Bennett, Miss Sterling is waking up. She's asking for you. Lucas stood and walked to Clara's room. Emma was asleep in the chair, exhausted from the ordeal. Clara's eyes were open, still groggy from the medication, but focused on him. You came, she whispered. Yes, Lucas said simply. You saved us. I did what I could. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Daniel told me about you. He said you were the bravest person he knew. He said if I ever needed help, really needed help, to find you. Lucas pulled a chair close to her bedside and sat down. He saved my life once. I owed him everything. He loved you like a brother, Clara said softly. I loved him too, Lucas replied, his voice breaking. And I'm sorry I wasn't there when he needed me. Clara reached out and took his hand. He wouldn't want you to carry that guilt. He would want you to live, to be happy. Lucas looked down at their joined hands. I don't know if I remember how to be happy. Clara squeezed his hand gently. Maybe we can figure it out together. They sat in silence for a long moment, two broken people connected by a man they both loved and lost. Finally, Lucas spoke. I'll stay, for as long as you need me, I promise. Clara smiled through her tears. Thank you. And in that hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the soft breathing of a sleeping child, something shifted, something healed, something began to grow. 3 days later, Clara was ready to be discharged from the hospital. Her condition had stabilized, and the doctors were confident she could continue her recovery at home with proper medication and rest. Lucas had barely left the hospital during those 3 days. He went home only to check on Emily, to reassure her that everything was okay, and then returned to sit with Clara and Emma. Uma had become attached to him in a way that surprised everyone. She would hold his hand during meals, sit in his lap while watching television in the hospital room, and ask him to read her stories before bedtime. It was as if she had decided he was safe, he was trustworthy, and he wasn't going anywhere. Lucas found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Needed. Not just as a worker, not just as a father, but as a person who mattered to someone outside his own small world. On the morning of Clara's discharge, the hospital room was full of visitors. Margaret was there, coordinating the logistics of getting Clara home. Several board members from Sterling Group stopped by to check on their CEO. And surprisingly, many of the neighbors from Clara's apartment building came to apologize. The older man in the expensive bathrobe approached Lucas with genuine remorse in his eyes. Mr. Bennett, I need to apologize again. I judged you based on appearances, and I was completely wrong. You saved Clara's life while I stood there making accusations. I'm ashamed of myself. Lucas stood and shook the man's hand. What matters is that she's okay. That's all that matters. The woman in silk pajamas approached next, her voice quiet. I said terrible things about you that night. I'm so sorry. You're a hero, and I treated you like a criminal. Don't apologize to me, Lucas said gently. I'm not the one who was hurt by your words. Clara is the one who needed help, and I was just in the right place at the right time. But his humility only made them feel worse. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss him based on nothing but his appearance. And he had proven them wrong in every possible way. A nurse who had been caring for Clara pulled Lucas aside. I've been doing this for 20 years, she said, and I've never seen anyone stay as calm during a crisis as you did. Most people panic when someone they care about is in danger. But you were like ice. Where did you learn that? I used to be a paramedic, Lucas explained. Emergency rescue. You learn to shut off the panic and just focus on what needs to be done. The nurse nodded. Well, you saved her life. I hope you know that. Lucas looked over at Clara, who was sitting up in bed, laughing at something Emma was saying. I just did what anyone should do. But most people don't, the nurse said. Most people freeze. Most people make excuses. Most people don't show up at 2 a.m. for a stranger. You did. That makes you different. When it was finally time to leave, Lucas helped Clara into a wheelchair, while Emma held her mother's hand. Margaret had arranged for a car to take them home, and security would then increased at the apartment building. As they rode the elevator down to the ground floor, Clara looked up at Lucas. I don't know how to thank you properly. You don't need to thank me, Lucas said. Yes, I do, Clara insisted. You saved my life. You took care of Emma when I couldn't. You've been here every day, even though you have your own daughter to take care of. That's not something I can just brush aside. Lucas knelt down so he was at her eye level. Daniel was my best friend. He saved my life once. If I could do this for his family, for the people he loved, then I've repaid a debt I've carried for years. That's all the thanks I need. Clara's eyes filled with tears. He chose the right person to trust. They arrived at Clara's apartment building, and Lucas helped her inside. Emma ran ahead, excited to be home. As Lucas turned to leave, Clara grabbed his hand. Please don't go. Not yet. I feel safe when you're here. Lucas looked at her, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and nodded. I'll stay. Emma cheered and grabbed his other hand. Can you read me a story? And Lucas, who had spent 3 years building walls around his heart, felt those walls begin to crack. Lucas sat on the couch in Clara's living room, holding Emily on one knee and Emma on the other. Both girls were giggling as he read them a story about a brave knight who rescued a queen from a dragon. Clara watched from her armchair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a small smile on her face. For the first time in months, she felt something other than stress and pain. She felt peace. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep on the couch, Clara and Lucas sat together in the quiet. Can I ask you something? Clara said softly. Of course, Oshara. Why did you really leave the rescue team? Margaret told me you were one of the best. Why walk away? Lucas was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. The day Daniel died, I wasn't on duty. I had taken the day off to spend time with my wife. When I got the call that there had been an accident, that Daniel was gone, I felt like I had failed him. Like if I had been there, maybe things would have been different. Clara shook her head. You can't think like that. I know, Lucas said, but grief doesn't listen to logic. I quit the team because I couldn't handle losing anyone else. I couldn't handle the responsibility of other people's lives. So I walked away and built a smaller, safer life. But you came when I called, Clara pointed out. Because it was Daniel's name, Lucas said. Even through all the pain and fear, even after 3 years of trying to forget, when I heard his name, I couldn't stay away. I owed him too much. Clara reached over and took his hand. My husband trusted you with the most important thing in his life. Me and Emma. That's not a small thing. I know, Lucas whispered. So don't leave us, Clara said, her voice breaking. I know we've only known each other for a few days. I know this is strange and complicated, but Emma has bonded with you, and honestly, so have I. I feel safer when you're here. Like nothing bad can happen as long as you're around. Lucas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a powerful CEO, but a woman who had lost her husband, who was raising a daughter alone, who was barely holding everything together. I have my own daughter, Lucas said gently. I can't just abandon my life. I'm not asking you to, Clara said quickly. I'm asking you to expand it. Emily and Emma could be friends. You could bring her here. Let the girls play together. Let us be part of your life and let you be part of ours. Lucas thought about his tiny apartment, his 3 jobs, his constant exhaustion. And then he thought about this beautiful home, these 2 people who needed him, and the possibility of something more. Okay, he said finally. Let's try. Clara smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since Daniel died. Over the next few weeks, Lucas and Clara's lives began to intertwine. Emily and Emma became inseparable, playing together every afternoon. Clara offered Lucas a job managing security for Sterling Group, using his rescue and emergency training. He accepted, grateful to finally have stable work that used his skills. They had dinner together 3 times a week. They celebrated birthdays. They supported each other through hard days and celebrated victories together. And slowly, carefully, Lucas felt himself healing. The guilt over Daniel's death didn't disappear, but it softened. He began to understand that honoring Daniel's memory didn't mean drowning in guilt. It meant taking care of the people Daniel loved. One evening, as Lucas watched the two girls playing in Clara's living room, Clara sat down beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For showing up that night, for staying, for being exactly the person Daniel said you were." Lucas smiled. "I'm just glad I answered the phone." "Me too," Clara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. And in that moment, Lucas realized something profound. Respect doesn't come from titles or money or status. It comes from how you treat people in their weakest moments. It comes from showing up when no one else will. It comes from keeping promises, even to the dead. He had spent 3 years running from his past, hiding from his pain. But that wrong number at 2 a.m. had changed everything. It had brought him back to life. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Hidden Heart Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.